I have translated 2,000 conversations in 15 years. Land disputes, debt arguments, doctor's visits, marriages, last rites, accusations, apologies. I carried them all across the gap between Spanish and English, and I never once added a word of my own. The people of San Pedro needed my voice to speak for them. They never needed mine. The first time I said something that was entirely my own, it was not because I had finally decided to. It was because he asked. My name is Luciana Vega. I was born in 1836 in the valley of the Rio Grande, when New Mexico was still part of Mexico and the border had not yet been drawn through the middle of everything my family had known. My father spoke both languages because trade required it. When he died, he left me the mercantile in San Pedro and the 2 languages and not much else. And I built from those things a life that was sufficient, and sometimes more than sufficient, and occasionally, in the evenings when the mercantile was closed and my children were grown and the house was too quiet, exactly as insufficient as I knew it to be. Rodrigo had been the sound in the house. He worked the copper mine 12 miles north, the Esperanza mine, and he came home on Fridays smelling of earth and copper dust and the particular kind of tired that a man carries when he has spent a week underground. He died in the winter of 1874, when a support beam shifted and the tunnel took 3 men in the space of a breath. He was 41 years old. We had been married for 22 years and had 3 children, and I had never once been afraid of silence until the winter after he died, when I understood that silence was not the absence of sound, but the presence of everything that would not come back. The town of San Pedro had 600 people in 1880, of which perhaps 250 spoke English as their first or only language. The rest were Spanish speakers, old families whose grandparents had been born Mexican citizens, newer arrivals from Chihuahua and Sonora, a few from further south. The 2 communities shared a plaza and a church and a general store, and the particular uneasy commerce of a border territory where the official language was still being established. I was the seam between them. A seam is necessary. A seam holds 2 pieces of cloth together. A seam does not have a pattern of its own. I started translating more after Rodrigo died. Not deliberately, there had always been need for it, and need does not slow for grief, but I gave it more of myself after 1874. I went to disputes I had not been asked to attend because I had heard there might be difficulty. I offered my services at the land office when the Anglo settlers began arriving in larger numbers in the late 1870s. Drawn by the railroad and the land surveys and the particular belief that the Treaty of 1848 had made the territory's land available in ways that the old families did not agree with. I made myself indispensable, which is one of the things a person does when they have lost the person who made them feel substantial without trying. Declan Callahan arrived in San Pedro on the 3rd of September, 1880. He came from the General Land Office in Washington, which had been sending surveyors and inspectors through the territory for 2 years, working through the disputed land grants that the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo had promised to honor and that the subsequent decades had made complicated. He was the 3rd inspector to be assigned to our county in 18 months. The first 2 had lasted 6 weeks and 4 weeks respectively, defeated by the heat and the hostility and the impossibility of doing a job that required everyone's cooperation in a situation where nobody agreed on the terms. Declan lasted. I noticed this early and noted it without drawing conclusions from it. What I did draw conclusions from was his method. The first 2 inspectors had tried to do their work through whatever interpreter happened to be available. A boy who worked at the hotel and spoke adequate English, an elderly man who translated slowly and imprecisely and occasionally invented words that were not quite right in either language. Declan had been in San Pedro for 4 hours before he came to me, and he had spent those 4 hours, as I learned later, asking at the land office and the church and the general store who the best interpreter in the county was. Everyone sent him to me. He arrived with a list of questions he had prepared in advance, which told me he had thought about the work before he arrived rather than improvising as he went. The questions were organized in a logical order, which told me he understood that clarity of sequence mattered when communication was already complicated by language. He had written them in a clear hand, which told me he had considered that I might need to read them. I noted all of this and went to work. He came to me the day after his arrival, having been told at the land office that I was the person to see. He introduced himself with his full name, removed his hat when he did so, and explained the nature of his work without condescension and without apology. He asked if I would be willing to serve as interpreter during his survey work. He asked, specifically, what my standard fee was for interpretation services, which no one had ever done before. Everyone else had simply assumed that my willingness was either charitable or reciprocally obligated. Declan pulled out a ledger and wrote down the number I told him and initialed beside it. I liked him before I was ready to like him, which I noted and set aside. The work was what it was. New Mexico Territory in 1880 was a place where two systems of land ownership existed in uneasy parallel: the old Spanish and Mexican land grants, which were legally complex and often poorly documented by the standards of American law, and the newer homestead claims and purchase contracts, which were legally cleaner and culturally devastating to families who had worked the same land for 100 years. Declan's job was to survey, document, and provide the General Land Office with accurate records. What to do with those records was someone else's decision. He was very precise about this distinction, and he was correct about it, and I watched him carry the precision of it with the specific care of a man who knows that precision is not the same as justice and has had to make peace with that. I translated for him every day for 3 weeks. Claims, counterclaims, boundaries, measurements, family histories going back to the Spanish colonial period. I translated in both directions, his careful English into Spanish that carried the weight of what was at stake, the family's Spanish into English that conveyed what they were actually saying rather than just the words they used. This last part was the skill. Anyone can translate words. Translating what someone means, what they are afraid of, what they are too proud to say directly, this is the work that has no name in English. In Spanish we have a sense of it. The word is entender, which is not just to understand, but to be inside the understanding. I was inside the understanding of every person I translated for. I was outside my own. This is the specific work of the interpreter that no one names. You are inside two minds simultaneously, the mind of the person speaking and the mind of the person hearing, and you are responsible for the passage between them. A bad interpreter translates words. A competent interpreter translates meaning. A great interpreter translates what the person would have meant if they had the other language available to them. This requires that you understand not just the words, but the person, their anger or their pride or their grief, the specific angle of their fear, the thing they will not say directly but are saying obliquely. You carry all of this across the gap and you leave yourself on this side. For 15 years I had left myself on this side. I had become very good at it. In the 3rd week, Declan asked me something during a break between meetings, sitting on the bench outside the land office with his hat in his hands and his satchel at his feet. He said, "When you translate for Señora Dominguez, you pause before you give me her words. Not long. A second. You don't do that with anyone else." I said, "I'm giving you her words correctly." He said, "I know. I'm asking why you pause." I looked at the plaza, the esquina running along the east side, the water going its slow direction, the cottonwood trees at the edge already going gold at the tips in the early autumn. I said, "Señora Dominguez says things that don't translate directly. Her Spanish carries something that English doesn't have a word for." He said, "What does she say today that doesn't have a word?" I thought about it. I said, "She says her grandfather built that house." In Spanish the verb is different. It is not built the way you would say built a table. It is the verb you use for something that was created with intention to last, that her grandfather made that house to last past his own life. The English word built doesn't carry that. Declan was quiet. He said, "How do you say it in Spanish?" I told him. He repeated it imperfectly. I corrected the vowel. He tried again, better. He wrote it in his ledger. He said, "And how do you say? Here is what someone means," underneath what they said. I looked at him. He looked back at me with the specific attention of a man who is asking the question he actually wants to ask rather than the one he came prepared to ask. It was the first time in 3 weeks that I had felt his attention on me rather than on what I was carrying for someone else. I said, "You can't translate that. You have to feel it." He said, "Do you feel it for everyone you translate for?" I said, "Yes." He said, "What do you feel when you translate for yourself?" I sat with that question for a long time. long enough that he did not try to fill the silence, which told me something about him, that he understood the silence was the work of the question rather than a gap to be covered. The askia made its sound, and the cottonwood leaves moved in the September afternoon, and I held the question the way you hold something that is both familiar and unfamiliar, like a word in your own language that you have said so many times it has temporarily lost its meaning. And there it was, the question that I had not been asked in 15 years, or perhaps had never been asked. I sat with it for a long moment. I was aware of the asquihia and the cottonwoods and the particular quality of the September light in New Mexico, which is different from the light of any other month, cleaner, as if the summer has finally finished its argument with the sky and left the air transparent. I said, "I don't translate for myself." He said, "I know. I've been trying to understand why." I went home that evening and sat in the mercantile after I closed it, in the chair behind the counter where I had sat for 20 years, and I thought about the question. I thought about Rodrigo and the sound he had made in the house and the silence he had left. I thought about the 2,000 conversations I had carried, and the thing I had made of my carrying, the being necessary, the being indispensable, the being the place where two languages met. A bridge is useful. A bridge does not ask for anything. A bridge does not have its own direction. I had made myself into a bridge when I did not know what else to be, after Rodrigo. It was not a bad choice. It had held weight for 15 years. But bridges do not speak. The unjust decision came in the 4th week. The Montoya family, 4 generations on a land grant that predated American sovereignty, had a claim that the General Land Office, based on Declan's survey, was required to adjudicate against their favor. The original grant documents were incomplete by American legal standards. The surveyed boundary conflicted with a competing homestead claim filed by an Anglo settler in 1877. The law was clear. The law was also, in this case, a mechanism for taking from a family what they had held for 130 years and giving it to a man who had been in New Mexico for 3. I knew the Montoyas. I had translated for them at every stage of this process. I had translated their grandmother's account of her grandfather's grant, and I had translated the letter they sent to the territorial governor, and I had translated the surveyor's findings back to them with careful neutrality, and I had translated the final determination that afternoon in the land office with the same careful neutrality, and I had walked home afterward with the weight of what I had done sitting on my shoulders where the rebozo usually sat. I did not add anything. I did not editorialize. I had not been asked to editorialize. I was the bridge. That night I sat with the weight and I thought about what I was. Declan came to the mercantile the next morning before I had opened. He knocked in the careful way he did everything, precisely, not too hard. I opened the door. He was holding his hat and had left his satchel behind, which I noticed because he never went anywhere without the satchel. He said, "I came to say something to you specifically, not to relay to anyone else, not for the record, just to you." I said, "Come in." He came in. I left the door open for propriety and stood behind the counter because it was where I stood, and he stood on the customer's side, and there was the counter between us with the cinnamon and dried chili and tobacco smells of the mercantile around us. He said, "I know what yesterday cost you." I said, "It was my job." He said, "Yes, and it cost you something anyway. Those two things are both true." I looked at the counter, at my hands on the counter. The ring I still wore on the right hand, which is where we wore them. The silver one Rodrigo had given me in 1852. He said, "I have been speaking through you for 4 weeks, and I realized 2 days ago that in 4 weeks I have never once asked you what you think, about anything. I have used your voice to say things, and I have listened to you translate other people's things, and I have never asked for one of your own words." I said, "That's what a translator is for." He said, "I know. But it is not all you are for." I looked at him across the counter. This man with his red auburn beard and his ink-stained fingers and his felt hat and his absent satchel, who had written down my fee in a ledger on his first day and had repeated the Spanish verb until he got the vowel right, who had noticed that I paused before I gave him Senora Dominguez's words. He said, "I'd like to ask you something, and I'd like your answer, not a translation of it, just what you think, in whichever language feels like yours." I said, "They are both mine." He said, "Then either one." He asked me something small and specific, not about the land or the survey or the Montoyas or any of the weight of the previous weeks. He asked me where I was from. Not San Pedro, he said. He knew San Pedro. Where was I from, in the sense of where had I come from, what had made me? I told him. In Spanish, for the first part, the valley, my father's mercantile, the two languages, the feeling of living always in the space between things, and then in English, for the second part, Rodrigo, the mine, the winter of 1874, the silence, the bridge I had made myself into. He listened without preparing his response while I was still talking. He did not look at his hands or at the counter or at anything except me. When I was done, he said, in very careful Spanish, the vowels almost right, that he was sorry about Rodrigo. He had practiced the sentence, I could tell, since our conversation on the bench. I said, "Your vowel is better." He almost smiled. He said, "I had a good teacher." I did not say anything else for a moment. Then I reached under the counter and took out the small notebook I used for keeping accounts, the practical Spanish of debts and inventories, flour and calico and coffee, and I tore out a page. I stood there for a moment with the page and the pen and the particular weight of a woman who has been a bridge for 15 years and is about to say something that goes nowhere but to the person in front of her. I wrote in both languages, not a translation. I did not translate myself into the other language, which would have been the old habit, the bridge habit. I wrote the same thing twice, in each language separately. The way the same thing looks different in Spanish and in English, not because the meaning changes, but because the words carry different histories. I wrote what I would have said to Rodrigo if I had said it, which I had not because I had always thought there was time. I folded it and held it out, not in the account language, the clean practical Spanish of debts and figures, in the other kind, the kind that carries what is meant underneath what is said. I folded it and held it out. He took it. He read it. His face did something I watched happen and did not try to name, because some things communicate better without the name. He folded the paper. He put it in his coat pocket, the inside pocket, where he kept nothing else. He said, "Thank you." I said, "Those were my own words." He said, "I know. That's why I'm keeping them." He stayed in San Pedro for another 6 weeks. The work gave him legitimate reasons, and he used them. When the work was finished, he went back to Washington with his survey records and his document satchel and the paper in his inside coat pocket, and I went back to the mercantile and the two languages and the chair behind the counter. He left for Washington in October. He shook my hand at the door of the mercantile on the morning he left, which was a formal thing to do and which I understood was the only formal thing he knew how to do in that moment, and I shook his hand back. And I watched him walk to his horse with the satchel on his left shoulder, and he mounted without looking back, which I knew was deliberate because he was a man who always looked where he was going, and looking back would have made leaving harder. He wrote in November, a letter in English with one line of Spanish at the end that had a vowel error I found I did not want to correct. The letter was 3 pages long and was about nothing in particular: Washington weather, the reports he was filing, a book he had been reading, a question about whether the asquicha in San Pedro ran year-round or dried in the winter. He did not mention the note I had given him. He did not have to. It was in the tone of the letter, the way a thing is present when it is the reason for everything around it. I wrote back, 2 pages, my own words, both languages, nothing translated from anyone else's. In the spring he came back to New Mexico, not on assignment. He had applied for a transfer to the Santa Fe office, which took 3 months to process and which he had filed for in October before I had written back in November, which was a sequence of events I thought about for a long time. He told me this on the second day of the spring visit, sitting in the chair on the customer's side of the counter while I made coffee behind it, and I looked at the sequence, October, November, spring, and understood that he had decided something before he knew how I would answer, which was either the most presumptuous thing or the most honest thing, and I decided, finally, that it was honest. I said, "Your Spanish is improving." He said, "I have been practicing." I said, "You still have the vowel error." He said, "I know. I thought you might correct it." I handed him the coffee. I said, "Maybe I will, eventually." He looked at the coffee and then at me across the counter, with the full attention he had always given things, and I thought about 2,000 conversations carried for other people and the one language I had finally remembered I had. I did not need to translate that look. It was already in mine. That was the whole of it. That was everything.